January 12, 1976, Gulfport, Mississippi. A young mother is abducted from her home, her 3-year-old child left behind to sleep. Hours later, she is shot once in the back of the head in the DeSoto National Forest. But even after killing her, Gerald Jordan calls her husband, demanding $25,000 in ransom, pretending she is still alive. The next day, he is captured and confesses. Yet justice would take nearly 50 years, through 4 death sentences and countless appeals, before Mississippi finally carried out his execution in 2025. Gerald Jordan was born in 1946 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Those who knew him as a boy remembered nothing unusual, an ordinary student, polite and unremarkable. But small warning signs appeared early. As a teenager and young man, he forged checks, choosing deception over accountability. Later, during his Army service, he faced a court-martial for falsifying official records. Again, rather than face consequences, he sought a way around them. His time in the military marked him deeply. Jordan served 3 tours in Vietnam, often in perilous positions. He flew as a helicopter gunner, firing from above to protect ground troops. It was dangerous, brutal work, and he returned home with invisible scars. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder shaped his outlook. Suspicion of strangers, sleepless nights, and emotional detachment. But while those experiences left him damaged, they did not excuse what would follow. Many veterans bore similar wounds. Very few chose to turn their pain into calculated violence. By the mid-1970s, Jordan's life was unraveling. He had married and become the father of 3 children, yet financial stress weighed heavily on the household. He worked briefly in a fertilizer plant, then at a shipyard, but the jobs didn't last. Debts mounted, tensions grew, and Jordan became desperate for money. Instead of seeking honest work, he began looking for shortcuts. His pattern of evasion, visible since youth, had become a way of life. In early January 1976, he devised a plan. With no connection to the Marter family, he simply scanned for opportunity. A phone call to Gulf National Bank gave him the name of a commercial loan officer, Charles Marter. A local phone directory revealed the home address. That was all Jordan needed. The choice was not personal, it was practical. To him, the Marters represented wealth, and wealth meant ransom. At the heart of this plot was Edwina Marter, Charles's wife. 34 years old, she spent her days caring for their 2 young sons. Friends described her as warm and lively, someone who enjoyed games of cards, trips to the beach, and moments of laughter with her family. She drove a Volkswagen convertible, a small detail that reflected her cheerful spirit. She was, in every sense, a mother devoted to her home. But in Jordan's eyes, none of that mattered. He did not see her as a woman with children, or as a beloved wife. He saw only leverage. To him, Edwina became a bargaining chip, a way to pressure her husband into paying a sum he believed would change his own life. From a psychological perspective, this decision speaks volumes. Jordan was not acting in sudden anger. He prepared carefully, pawning his shotgun for a revolver, disguising himself to gain entry, and calculating every step of the plan. It was not impulse, it was strategy. His motive was simple, money, but his mindset was chilling. A man detached enough to strip away humanity from his victim, reducing a life to nothing more than currency. On the morning of January 12, 1976, Jordan put his plan into motion. Disguised as a utility worker, he approached the Marter home. Inside was Edwina, caring for her 3-year-old son, while her husband was at work and her older boy was at school. She opened the door to what must have seemed a routine visit. Instead, she faced a revolver. Jordan forced her into his car, leaving the child alone in the house. From the very beginning, every step was controlled. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind. No panic, no hesitation. Edwina was no longer a neighbor or a mother. In his eyes, she had become the centerpiece of a ransom scheme. He drove her nearly 35 miles into the quiet expanse of the DeSoto National Forest. There, away from witnesses, the plan turned darker. At some point, Jordan fired a single shot into the back of her head. Edwina's life ended in an instant, and with it, any chance of ransom becoming a negotiation. Yet Jordan did not stop. Hours after killing her, he called her husband, Charles, pretending she was still alive. His voice was calm, calculated, even cruel. "Leave $25,000 if you ever want to see her again." He gave instructions for a money drop, as if Edwina were waiting somewhere unharmed. This was not the action of a man overcome by rage. It was deception layered on top of violence, a deliberate act designed to prolong control and extract profit from a life already taken. Psychologically, it showed a chilling ability to compartmentalize. The murder was not the end. It was part of a broader strategy. Over the next 24 hours, Jordan played a cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement. He arranged drop sites, spotted surveillance, and shifted locations. At one point, he even lowered his demand from $50,000 to $25,000, adapting when he sensed the police were close. Each adjustment revealed the same mindset, a man focused on self-preservation, not remorse. Ultimately, his plan unraveled. After failed money exchange and a high-speed chase, Jordan was found in a taxi, carrying most of the ransom money. He confessed quickly, leading officers to Edwina's body and the weapon he had used. The truth was clear. From the moment he entered the Marter home, his path was one of calculation and cold resolve. Richard Jordan's arrest came swiftly. Less than 24 hours after the murder, police tracked him down in a taxi, the ransom money still in his possession. Under questioning, he confessed and led officers to both the body of Edwina Marter and the revolver he had used. The case against him was clear, but the journey through the courts would become one of the longest in Mississippi history. In July 1976, Jordan was tried for capital murder. The jury took only hours to convict him, and under Mississippi law at the time, death was the automatic sentence. But months later, the state Supreme Court struck down such mandatory sentences, ruling that juries must separately consider guilt and punishment. Jordan's sentence was overturned. A second trial in 1977 brought the same result, guilty and again condemned to die. Yet even that judgment was undone. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the jury had not received proper instructions during sentencing. Once more, Jordan's fate returned to the courts. By 1983, he faced a third sentencing hearing. Again, the outcome was death. But the U.S. Supreme Court later vacated that ruling as well, saying the jury had been barred from hearing evidence that might have weighed in his favor. In 1991, prosecutors offered a plea deal, life without parole, if he would agree to end all appeals. Jordan accepted, but he soon challenged even that sentence, arguing it was not a legal option in Mississippi at the time of his crime. The challenge succeeded. The deal unraveled, and in 1998, after more than 2 decades of litigation, a new jury sentenced him to death for the 4th time. Psychologically, the pattern was telling. Jordan's entire adult life reflected an effort to avoid accountability, whether by forging checks, falsifying records, or later, exploiting every legal avenue to escape the punishment imposed on him. While appeals are right in the American system, his relentless cycle revealed the same mindset he had shown since youth, seeking a way around consequences rather than facing them. For Edwina Marter's family, each reversal meant reliving the crime again and again. What should have been resolved in years stretched into decades. And through it all, Jordan remained on death row, the state's oldest inmate, a man sentenced to die 4 times before the punishment would finally be carried out. June 25, 2025, nearly 50 years after the murder of Edwina Marter, Mississippi carried out the sentence. Richard Gerald Jordan, 79 years old and the state's longest-serving death row inmate, was moved from his holding cell to the execution chamber at Parchman Prison. Hours earlier, He had been given the one small privilege afforded to every condemned inmate: a final meal. His choice was simple, almost ordinary: chicken tenders, French fries, strawberry ice cream, and a root beer float. It was a striking contrast. A meal of comfort, moments before the end of a life shaped by violence and decades of legal battles. At 6 p.m., witnesses filed into the viewing room. Among them were his wife, Marcia Jordan, his attorney, and a spiritual advisor. Across the glass, Jordan lay strapped to the gurney, a white sheet drawn across his body. When asked for last words, his voice was steady. He thanked the prison staff for what he called a humane way of doing this. He turned his words toward Edwina's family, apologizing for what he had done. Finally, he looked to his wife and said, "I love you. I will see you on the other side, all of you." At 6:02, the first drug was administered. Jordan's breathing slowed. A consciousness check confirmed he was no longer aware. By 6:16 p.m., he was pronounced dead. The atmosphere was quiet, almost clinical, yet heavy with the weight of nearly 5 decades. For some, it was the closing of a chapter. For others, it was a reminder of all that could never be restored. For the Marter family, the execution did not bring celebration, only a quiet sense of inevitability. Nearly 5 decades had passed since the night their lives were torn apart, and in those years, they had endured 4 trials, countless appeals, and endless delays. Edwina's son Eric, who was just 11 when his mother was taken, spoke plainly before the execution. "It should have happened a long time ago," he said. "I'm not really interested in giving him the benefit of the doubt. He needs to be punished." His younger brother Kevin, only a toddler at the time of the crime, carried few memories of his mother at all. For both men, childhood had been defined not by her presence, but by her absence. Their father, Charles Marter, now in his late 80s, chose not to witness Jordan's final moments. Neither did the 2 sons. Instead, other relatives represented the family in the chamber. Afterward, their spokesman read a statement. "Nothing will bring back our mom, sister, or friend. Nothing can ever change what Jordan took from us 49 years ago." For them, the execution was not closure in the sense of healing. It was closure in the sense of finality. Jordan could no longer delay the process, no longer reopen wounds with another appeal. Yet the hole left by Edwina's death remained, untouched by time. Nearly 50 years passed between the crime and the final sentence carried out. Richard Gerald Jordan's execution closed one of the longest chapters in Mississippi's history, but the loss of Edwina Marter will always remain. What do you think? Does an execution bring justice, or only an ending? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that explore crime, justice, and the people forever changed by them, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching. What drives a person to commit an act so heinous that it forever changes the lives of everyone around them? What happens when a past filled with trauma and violence shapes the future of a killer? This is the story of Thomas Lee Gudinas, a man who had been living on the edge, hiding behind a veil of normalcy, until one fateful night in Orlando. What began as a night out at a nightclub soon escalated into one of the most brutal, terrifying crimes that the city had ever seen. Join us as we uncover the chilling details of Gudinas' past, his terrifying actions, and the long road to justice that followed. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 28 years old, a man whose life had been marred by years of crime and personal turmoil. Born into a dysfunctional family, he grew up with a mother, Karen and Goldwaite, who was unable to provide a stable or loving environment. Gudinas faced physical and emotional abuse from an early age, leaving deep scars that would follow him into adulthood. At the age of 6, his troubled childhood led to him being placed in child care facilities, where he struggled with health and psychological issues. But despite his time in care, the damage had already been done. Gudinas was a product of a broken home and an unforgiving world, and soon, the consequences of his upbringing would play out in the most horrific way possible. On the night of May 23rd, 1994, Gudinas was in Orlando, visiting his relatives. It seemed like an ordinary night, one where he simply went out to enjoy himself. Little did anyone know, his violent past would soon resurface. He went to Barbarella nightclub, where he used a fake ID to get inside, blending in among the crowd. But this was no ordinary night out for Gudinas. This was the beginning of a horrific spiral that would end with the brutal murder. Around 2 a.m., as the night wore on, Rachel Smith, a fellow club-goer, stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. She walked across the parking lot, unaware that Gudinas was watching her. As Rachel approached her car, she noticed him following her. Gudinas, a stranger to Rachel, was now only a few steps behind her. Rachel tried to ignore it at first, but as his footsteps grew louder and closer, an unsettling chill crept up her spine. She quickly locked the doors of her car, her heart pounding. Gudinas, however, wasn't finished. He began banging on her window, shouting crude, threatening remarks. "I want to you," he yelled, his voice filled with rage. In a panic, Rachel hit the horn, hoping someone would hear and intervene. Luckily, Gudinas backed off, disappearing into the night, leaving Rachel in a state of shock. What Rachel didn't know was that the nightmare wasn't over. At around 3 a.m., Michelle McGrath, a 25-year-old woman, left the Barbarella nightclub. She stepped out into the night, unaware that she was being stalked by Thomas Gudinas. She was completely alone, walking to her car, oblivious to the danger that was following her every step. But this time, there would be no escape. Gudinas attacked Michelle in a dark alley, far from the safety of the crowds. He brutally assaulted her, knocking her unconscious. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he raped her. But Gudinas wasn't done. His violence escalated further as he began kicking and stomping on Michelle's head, causing devastating injuries. Michelle McGrath died from severe head trauma, her life taken in a way that no one could ever have imagined. Gudinas, driven by a need for control and dominance, didn't stop at the murder. He further violated Michelle's body, attempting to make a statement of his cruelty. When it was all over, he left Michelle's body discarded, causing even more shock and horror when her body was discovered the next morning. The next morning, on May 24th, 1994, Jane Brand, a school employee, was walking through the alleyway when she made the grisly discovery: the body of Michelle McGrath. The police were quickly called, and the investigation began immediately. What they uncovered was chilling. Evidence began to mount swiftly. Gudinas' fingerprints, his DNA, and Michelle's personal items, including her vehicle registration slip, were found at the scene, creating a direct link between him and the murder. But the investigation didn't stop there. Rachel Smith, still rattled from her own encounter with Gudinas, came forward. She identified him as the man who had harassed her just hours earlier. This critical piece of testimony helped solidify the connection between Gudinas and Michelle's brutal attack. As the investigation intensified, Gudinas was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Though he confessed his crime in private conversations with his cellmates, he maintained his innocence in front of authorities. The evidence was undeniable, and it didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. In 1995, Gudinas stood trial. The courtroom was tense as the details of Michelle's murder were presented, laying bare the brutality of his actions. The defense argued that Gudinas' troubled childhood and mental health issues should be taken into account, but the jury was unswayed. Gudinas was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury's decision was clear: death by electric chair. The courtroom, already shaken by the details of the crime, saw Gudinas break down in tears, but it was too late. His fate had been sealed. Even after his conviction, Gudinas fought to escape justice. He filed appeals, claiming that his abusive childhood and mental health issues should lead to a lesser sentence. But despite his best efforts, his appeals were repeatedly rejected. Years passed, and with each rejection, the family of Michelle McGrath grew increasingly frustrated. The wheels of justice had turned slowly, and it would take more than 30 years before Gudinas was finally scheduled to face the consequences of his actions. On June 24, 2025, the long road of waiting would finally come to an end. Gudinas would face his final reckoning. The family of Michelle McGrath, who had endured years of pain and uncertainty, would finally get the justice they had waited for. After over 30 years of appeals and legal battles, the moment of closure had arrived. But while Michelle's family felt a sense of relief, the pain of losing her would never fully fade. On the morning of June 24, 2025, after more than 3 decades of waiting, Thomas Lee Gudinas was brought to the edge of the end he had long tried to escape. For his last meal, he chose a Cuban sandwich, pizza, a hamburger, a ramen burger, and a glass of passion fruit juice, an eclectic mix that hinted at a longing for something familiar before the end. As he was strapped to the gurney, there were no final words from Gudinas. In stark contrast to the brutality of his crimes, his last moments were silent. No remorse, no apology, just the quiet hum of the execution chamber. For the victims' families, the silence was both a bitter reminder and a long-awaited closure. After decades of waiting, the man who had torn apart so many lives was gone, leaving behind only the echoes of his actions. As we reflect on the story of Thomas Gudinas, we're left with difficult questions. Is justice truly served when a life is taken in such a brutal way? Can the execution of a killer ever make up for the loss of a loved one? Gudinas' story is a stark reminder that the scars of the past can shape a person's future in ways we can't always predict. But it's also a story about the long, difficult road to justice, a journey filled with pain, loss, and the hope that one day the truth will prevail. What are your thoughts on justice, punishment, and the death penalty? Do you believe the right decision was made in the case of Thomas Gudinas? Leave your thoughts below and join the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of crime, justice, and the human condition. What happens when a man looks calm and smart on the outside, but hides something dark inside? On June 13th, 2025, after nearly 20 years on death row, Stephen Christopher Stanko was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. He was 57 years old. The crimes he committed shocked the state, and the full story is one of lies, violence, and justice that took far too long. Stephen Stanko was born in 1968 at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Growing up, people said he was bright, polite, and well-spoken. But many also noticed something strange. He didn't seem to connect with people emotionally. He had a hard time building strong relationships, even with family or close friends. When he was 15, Stephen lost his younger brother in a house fire. The cause was never confirmed, but there were quiet rumors that it wasn't just an accident. That event seemed to change his family. His father, once involved and strict, pulled away emotionally. As Stephen got older, he did well in school and had high SAT scores. He dreamed of going to the Air Force Academy, but he didn't get in. After that, his life began to fall apart. He dropped out of college, started stealing, and got involved in fraud. In the early 1990s, he dated a woman named Liz. At first, he seemed kind and smart, but things turned dark. He lied, stole from neighbors, and one night tried to smother her while she slept. In 1996, he was arrested for assault and kidnapping. A jury found him guilty, and he went to prison for 10 years. While in prison, Stanko began changing his image. He co-wrote a book called Living in Prison and told people he wanted to help others understand life behind bars. He seemed educated and thoughtful. He told others he had changed. When he was released in 2004, he moved to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. At first, he stayed quiet. He told people he was working on another book. He spent a lot of time in public libraries and started making new friends. One of those people was Laura Ling, a kind and friendly librarian. They began dating, and soon he moved into the home she shared with her 15-year-old daughter, Christina. He also became friendly with Henry Turner, a 74-year-old retired man who visited the library often. But while Stanko looked calm and smart on the outside, something terrifying was building inside him. On the night of April 7th, 2005, things took a deadly turn. Stanko later said that he and Laura had an argument. He claimed she slapped him and burned him with a lit cigarette. He said everything went black after that. But what happened next was far worse than just losing control. He tied Laura up, beat her, and strangled her. Then, he went to Christina's room. He raped her, hit her, and slit her throat. Thinking she was dead, he stepped over her, took a shower, and packed a bag. But Christina wasn't dead. Bleeding and in pain, she managed to call 911. Her voice was weak, but she told the operator that her mother was dead. By the time police arrived, Laura was gone, and so was Stanko. He had stolen Laura's credit cards and jewelry, and drove to Henry Turner's house. He told Henry that his father had died, and asked if he could stay for a while. Henry, being kind, said yes. The next morning, the two men had breakfast together, eggs, toast, and coffee. Later, as Henry was shaving in the bathroom, Stanko quietly walked in. He put a pillow over a gun and shot him in the neck. When Henry didn't die right away, he shot him again, this time in the chest. Stanko then stole Henry's truck and his bank cards. He used the money to buy drinks at local bars in Columbia, South Carolina. He smiled, laughed, and blended in with strangers, just hours after killing two people. Next, he drove to Augusta, Georgia. He met a woman and told her he owned restaurants and was in town for the Masters golf tournament. She believed him and let him stay at her house. But 4 days later, she saw his face in the newspaper. He was wanted for double murder. She called the police immediately. On April 12, 2005, U.S. Marshals arrested Stanko outside a bookstore. He didn't resist. He was calm, well-dressed, and polite. But behind that mask was a killer. Police searched his things and found stacks of articles about serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer and Gary Ridgway. It was clear Stanko had studied them. Some believed he wanted to become one of them. At trial, his lawyers said he had brain problems. They brought in doctors who said he had damage in the part of the brain that controls behavior and emotions. But other doctors disagreed. They said he knew exactly what he was doing. In 2006, Stanko was found guilty of killing Laura Ling and attacking her daughter. He was sentenced to death and given 110 years for the assault and rape. In 2009, he went on trial again for killing Henry Turner. He was given a second death sentence. Over the next 15 years, Stanko and his legal team filed many appeals. They said he had brain trauma, mental illness, and that his trials were unfair. But the courts rejected every argument. In May 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final appeal. South Carolina set the execution date for June 13th. By law, death row inmates in South Carolina can choose how they want to die: lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. At first, Stanko considered the firing squad. He thought it would be quick and clean. But after reading a report about another execution that went badly, where the person didn't die right away, he changed his mind. He chose lethal injection instead. For his last meal, he was given $20 to order anything. He chose a hamburger and ice cream. On the evening of June 13th, 2025, Stephen Stanko was taken into the execution chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution. Outside, protesters held signs. Inside, it was quiet. He was strapped to the gurney, and a needle was placed in his arm. His lawyer read a short final statement. "I am truly sorry for the pain and loss that I caused. Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said." As the sedative entered his body, he turned slightly toward the victims' families and moved his lips, possibly whispering something. Then he let out a few deep breaths and went still. At 6:34 p.m., he was declared dead. Stephen Christopher Stanko's story is a warning. He fooled many with his calm voice and sharp mind, but behind it was a man capable of great harm. So now we ask you, was it justice, or was it too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories, told with clarity and respect.
On June 12, 2025, after more than 2 decades of legal battles and delays, George John Hansen was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was 61 years old. The crimes that brought him to that gurney were brutal, calculated, and unforgettable. This is the full story of what happened, how justice was delayed for years, and the lives that were forever changed. It all began on August 31, 1999, in Tulsa County, Oklahoma. George Hansen and his accomplice, Victor Miller, had already committed 2 robberies that day, but they needed a car. One they hadn't used yet. One that couldn't be traced back to them. At Tulsa Promenade Mall, 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bowles had just finished shopping. She was a retired banker, known in her community for volunteering at the local hospital. As she loaded her groceries into the car, Hansen and Miller approached. Victor got behind the wheel. George forced Mary into the back seat at gunpoint. She had no chance to escape. The 2 men then drove away, heading toward rural roads outside Tulsa. But someone did see them. Nearby, Gerald Max Thurman, a 44-year-old trucking company owner, noticed something unusual. He saw the car circling a dirt pit near Owasso and sensed something wasn't right. He called his nephew to report it, then hung up. Moments later, Victor pulled a gun and shot him 4 times. Gerald collapsed on the spot but didn't die immediately. Thanks to a neighbor hearing the gunshots and calling it in, paramedics reached him while he was still alive. But tragically, he never woke up. 2 weeks later, he died in the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. Hansen and Miller didn't wait to see if he survived. They kept driving, still with Mary trapped in the back of the car. Somewhere along a remote stretch of road, they pulled over. Mary was dragged from the vehicle. Hansen threw her to the ground and shot her 4 to 6 times with a 9mm pistol. Her body was then covered with branches and left behind. Search teams didn't find her for a full week. On September 7, 1999, Mary's body was discovered in that dirt pit, still hidden beneath sticks and debris. Meanwhile, the killers were trying to blend in. After abandoning Mary's car at the Oasis Motel, they acted as if nothing had happened. Hansen even spoke with the motel clerk, signed a rental card with his own ID, and borrowed a screwdriver to try and fix the car. But when it didn't start, they gave up and left the vehicle behind. Over the next week, they continued robbing businesses. On September 3rd, they hit another liquor store. On September 8th, they robbed a credit union. The break in the case came the next day, September 9th. Victor Miller's wife made an anonymous phone call. She told police the 2 men were hiding at an Econo lodge. At the same time, investigators noticed Mary's abandoned car still sitting at the Oasis Motel. Police moved quickly. Victor surrendered without a fight. Hansen, on the other hand, locked himself inside a motel room. Officers had to use tear gas to bring him out. When they searched the room, they found both murder weapons, plus extra ammunition hidden in a toilet tank. The evidence quickly piled up. Hansen's fingerprint was found on the seatbelt buckle in Mary's car. Victor's prints were on the passenger door. And a witness, Rashad Barnes, a friend of Hansen's, later testified that Hansen had admitted to everything: the robbery, the kidnapping, the murders. According to Barnes, it was Hansen who pulled the trigger on Mary, while Miller had shot Gerald. In May 2001, George Hansen stood trial for the 2 murders. By then, his criminal record stretched back nearly 20 years. He had been arrested for robbery, assault, and other violent crimes. But this time he was facing the highest charge of all: capital murder. The trial was brief. Jurors deliberated for only 5 hours before returning their verdict: guilty on both counts. For killing Mary Bowles, Hansen was sentenced to death. For Gerald Thurman's murder, he received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Victor Miller was later found guilty as well. Though he had previously served prison time for another murder, his death sentence was removed in 2015 after appeals. He now serves 2 life sentences with no parole. But for Hansen, the legal fight continued. After the verdict, he was transferred to a high-security federal prison in Louisiana to serve a life sentence for robbery charges. Oklahoma, however, still held the right to carry out the execution. For years, Hanson's legal team tried to reverse the death sentence. They said his troubled childhood had not been fully considered. Records revealed he had experienced serious abuse as a child and struggled with addiction for much of his life. His lawyers argued these details should have been enough to avoid a death sentence. But the courts didn't agree. His execution was first scheduled for December 15, 2022. But the transfer back to Oklahoma was blocked by the federal government. The state filed a lawsuit, but the delay held. The execution was paused. For Gerald Thurman's family, that was another blow. His son Jake spoke about how hard it had been to wait for justice. He called his father a hero and said he still saw his father's face in his own children. Jake's mother passed away not long after the 2022 delay. She never got to see the execution she had waited over 2 decades for. Everything changed again in early 2025. A new attorney general allowed the transfer. On March 3, George Hanson was moved to Oklahoma's death row. His execution date was set for June 12. At his clemency hearing in May, Hanson spoke via video. He expressed remorse and apologized to the victims' families. "I'm not an evil person," he said. "I was caught in something I couldn't control. I would change it if I could." But clemency was denied. The board voted 3-2 in favor of execution. The process moved forward again. On the evening before his death, George John Hanson was offered a final meal. He didn't ask for anything special. He accepted the standard tray: chicken pot pie, 2 rolls, 2 fruit cups, and carrots. On the morning of June 12, 2025, he was led into the execution chamber. He was calm. He offered a final message: "Just forgive me and peace to everyone." At 10:11 a.m., George John Hanson was pronounced dead by lethal injection. It was the end of a long road, one filled with violence, pain, delays, and grief. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond issued a final statement. "The monster who abducted and murdered a 77-year-old woman more than 25 years ago has finally paid for his crime. The family of Mary Bowles has waited many agonizing years. And now that day has come."
So we ask you, was justice served in this case? Or did it take too long? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more true stories.
In the early hours of August 2nd, 1988, Karen Lane, just 32 years old, was brutally murdered in her apartment in Cordova, Alabama. Her body was found with 60 violent injuries, a brutal reminder of the rage that consumed her killer, Gregory Hunt. Their brief relationship ended in a fit of jealousy and violence. Hunt broke into her home, sexually assaulted her, and inflicted 60 brutal injuries that left her lifeless. What followed was a tragic tale of anger, betrayal, and crime so horrific it would haunt Lane's family for over 3 decades. Gregory Hunt was not a man with a clean record. Born in Florida, his life had been filled with struggles and personal failures. Having been married twice and moving frequently, Hunt's life seemed to be defined by instability. After his parents' divorce, he found himself in and out of foster care, struggling to find his place in the world. Despite these challenges, he eventually settled in Alabama, where he began a brief, volatile relationship with Karen Lane. Lane, a 32-year-old woman living in Cordova, Alabama, had recently ended a marriage and was trying to rebuild her life. She met Hunt, and what started as a short fling quickly turned into a relationship filled with warning signs. Although they had only been together for a month, Hunt's behavior began to show his darker tendencies. His jealousy soon became evident, and what should have been a brief relationship turned into something far more dangerous. Lane, unaware of Hunt's emotional instability, started to distance herself as his possessiveness grew, but this only fueled his resentment. Hunt's jealousy quickly morphed into an obsession. He couldn't accept the idea of losing control over the relationship. His actions became more erratic, and his mental state began to unravel. What began as a breakup for Lane turned into an emotional battleground for Hunt, one that he was determined to win at any cost. This was no longer just about the end of a relationship. It became about domination and revenge. Lane's rejection of him was a personal affront, and Hunt's inability to process this rejection in a healthy way turned his anger into something far more sinister. As the days passed, Hunt's obsession with Lane grew. When she tried to end things, he couldn't accept it. The feeling of losing control, of being cast aside, filled him with rage. His anger didn't just stem from hurt. It was about reclaiming what he felt was his. For Hunt, Lane's rejection wasn't just an emotional wound. It was a deep insult to his sense of self. This desire for control and his deep-seated anger would drive him to a point of no return. On the night of August 2nd, 1988, Hunt's jealousy and rage would spill over in the most violent way imaginable, leaving a young woman dead and a family shattered. On the night of August 2nd, 1988, a quiet evening in Cordova, Alabama, was shattered by the actions of Gregory Hunt. His mind, clouded by growing jealousy and anger, drove him to take matters into his own hands. Lane had begun to distance herself from him, and in his eyes, that was a rejection he couldn't bear. The relationship, which had lasted barely a month, had ended, and Hunt's emotions erupted in violence. He couldn't accept her decision to move on. Around midnight, Hunt broke into Lane's apartment. As he forced the door open, the reality of what was to come set in. Lane, completely unaware, was suddenly faced with a man who was no longer the person she had once trusted, but a violent figure driven by emotions he could not control. Once inside, Hunt immediately attacked Lane, overpowering her in a moment of raw, unrestrained rage. He inflicted brutal injuries on her, but it wasn't just the physical assault that was terrifying. Hunt's state of mind during the attack showed a man who had already lost touch with any form of compassion or control. The violence wasn't just about hurting her. It was about punishing her for rejecting him. The force of his blows shattered Lane's body, leaving her unrecognizable. At some point, Hunt sexually assaulted Lane, further brutalizing her. This wasn't simply an act of rage anymore. It was the culmination of Hunt's need for control, his belief that he could dominate Lane in every way possible. The violence he used wasn't just about the physical act of hurting her, but about owning her, showing her that she could not escape him. The moment Lane tried to pull away, Hunt's anger pushed him to a point where nothing else mattered. He had already decided that she would pay for her rejection, no matter the cost. After the attack, Hunt left the apartment, but the horror wasn't over. He made a casual phone call, nonchalantly telling the boyfriend of one of Lane's friends to check on her. It was as if he had convinced himself that he could just walk away from the crime, as if the violence he had just committed could somehow be erased. "She's on the kitchen floor," Hunt said during the call, an attempt to make the situation seem insignificant, even though he had just ended Lane's life in the most brutal way possible. In the days that followed, Hunt was quick to try and deflect suspicion. But despite his attempts to hide his involvement, the evidence was already stacking up against him. His fingerprints and DNA were found at the scene, and a witness reported seeing him enter Lane's apartment just hours before the attack. The brutality of his actions and his failure to comprehend the magnitude of what he had done were apparent to everyone but him. As Hunt sat in his cell, facing the consequences of his actions, he would later express remorse in a way that still seemed disconnected from the depth of the violence he had inflicted. "I can't explain what happened. All I can say is that she didn't deserve what happened to her." But his words rang hollow, as his actions spoke louder than any apology could ever express. After the brutal murder of Karen Lane, Gregory Hunt quickly became the primary suspect. Evidence gathered from the scene, including Hunt's fingerprints and DNA, directly linked him to the crime. A witness had seen Hunt entering Lane's apartment earlier that night, and his own actions, from the phone call to the boyfriend of Lane's friend, were all pieces of the puzzle that led to his arrest. The trial, which took place in 1990, was a defining moment. Hunt was convicted of capital murder for the killing of Lane. The jury, after deliberating, voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the violence of the crime, the clear motive of jealousy and rage, and the testimonies from key witnesses all pointed to Hunt's guilt. Despite this, Hunt continued to maintain his innocence, filing multiple appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction. He claimed that the autopsy findings were inaccurate, but his arguments were dismissed as lacking merit. His repeated attempts to delay his execution were denied, with the Alabama Attorney General's office firmly stating that Hunt had already exhausted his appeal process. After 35 long years on death row, Gregory Hunt's day of reckoning finally arrived. On June 10, 2025, he was led to the execution chamber at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, where he would face the consequences of his actions. This time, the method of execution was nitrogen hypoxia, a new and controversial method that had already been used in previous executions in Alabama. In the hours leading up to his execution, Hunt was given the opportunity for a last meal, a final request many inmates use to reflect on their last moments. However, in a striking move, Hunt chose to decline the last meal, an eerie decision that seemed to reflect his detachment from the gravity of his situation. Instead, he had a simple lunch tray, consisting of bologna, black-eyed peas, carrots, and fruit punch. It was a humble meal, a stark contrast to the intense emotions that surrounded the moment of his death. As the curtain in the viewing chamber lifted, Hunt was strapped to a gurney. He was calm, almost eerily so. He didn't speak, didn't make any final statements. Instead, he gave a thumbs up and even flashed what appeared to be a peace sign, a gesture that, to many, felt disconnected from the gravity of his past actions. At 5:54 p.m., the mask was placed over Hunt's face, and the nitrogen gas began to flow. For a few moments, Hunt's breathing grew labored, and his body began to twitch. His head lifted slightly from the gurney, then his feet raised as his body jerked. The watching witnesses could only watch in silence as Hunt struggled for breath, his body shaking involuntarily. The process wasn't swift. His body fought the gas as his limbs convulsed. By 6:05 p.m., Hunt's breathing had ceased. His body stilled. The finality of the moment settled over the chamber. The curtain was drawn, and at 6:26 p.m., the official time of death was declared. This was the end of Gregory Hunt's long journey, but for Lane's family, it was a bitter resolution. For them, it wasn't about closure. It was about seeing justice finally served, even if it didn't bring their loved one back. The pain of Karen Lane's violent death would never be erased, but in that moment, they knew her killer would never hurt anyone again. Gregory Hunt's execution marks the end of a long journey for justice, but for Lane's family, it was never about closure. The truth is, no execution could ever erase the pain of losing a loved one in such a violent, senseless manner. The execution served as a final step in a process that had stretched over decades. For the family, it was justice, but not healing. That's everything about Gregory Hunt case. Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and may justice always prevail. On June 10, 2025, after more than 3 decades of appeals and legal battles, Anthony Floyd Wainwright was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 54 years old. The crimes that brought him there were shocking, opportunistic, and devastating. This is the story of a young mother's life stolen, the long road to justice, and the pain carried by those left behind. But right before we dive in the case, leave a comment and let me know where you watch it from. Carmen Gabriela Gayhart was just 23 years old, a devoted wife, a mother of 2 young children, and a nursing student. She had only recently moved into what her family called their dream home. She was described by those who knew her as kind, gentle, and full of love for her children and even for animals. Anthony Wainwright, the man who would later end her life, was also 23 at the time. He had escaped from a North Carolina prison with another inmate, Richard Hamilton. Both were on the run, desperate for money, weapons, and a car that could carry them further away. The motive behind their actions was not a carefully planned vendetta. It was an act of opportunistic violence. They saw Carmen alone in the supermarket parking lot, and in that moment, she became a target. From a psychological perspective, Wainwright's choice reflected a mindset of control and dehumanization, seeing her not as a person, but as an obstacle and an opportunity. On April 27, 1994, Carmen Gayhart finished her nursing class and stopped at a Winn-Dixie supermarket in Lake City, Florida. It was broad daylight, just an ordinary afternoon. With her arms full of grocery bags, she was preparing to pick up her 5-year-old daughter and 3-year-old son from daycare. That was the moment Anthony Wainwright and Richard Hamilton struck. Recently escaped from a North Carolina prison, armed and desperate, they forced Carmen into her own blue Ford Bronco at gunpoint, in the middle of a busy parking lot. No one seemed to notice what had just happened. The two men drove her to a remote wooded area in Hamilton County. There, Carmen endured a terrifying assault before her life was ended. She was strangled and shot twice in the back of the head with a bolt-action rifle. For 5 long days, her loved ones waited in anguish until deputies finally found her body off a dirt road. She was still wearing a pink shirt, her favorite color, a heartbreaking reminder of who she was beyond the crime. Psychologically, the attack revealed more than cruelty. It showed a drive for total control, overpowering her, silencing her, and erasing her presence. In that moment, Carmen was no longer seen as a mother or a daughter, but as something to be used and discarded in their desperate escape. The day after Carmen's murder, law enforcement closed in on the two fugitives. Wainwright and Hamilton were spotted in Mississippi, more than 500 miles from the crime scene, still driving Carmen's blue Ford Bronco. When a state trooper attempted to stop them, the men opened fire. A gunfight followed. Both were wounded but survived, and officers finally brought their violent escape to an end. This was the critical turning point. From escaped prisoners on the run, Wainwright and Hamilton were now identified as the men who had abducted, assaulted, and killed a young mother of 2. The very car they had stolen from Carmen carried them directly into custody. The trial came swiftly in 1995. Each man tried to shift the blame onto the other, denying full responsibility for Carmen's death. But the jury saw through the contradictions. Both were convicted of murder, kidnapping, robbery, and rape. The jurors unanimously recommended the death penalty for Wainwright, and the judge sentenced both men to die in Florida's electric chair, adding 3 life terms each for their other crimes. From a psychological perspective, this stage revealed a clear pattern. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence, Wainwright refused to accept accountability. Instead, he attempted to fragment the truth and distance himself from the consequences, an avoidance that would echo throughout his decades of appeals. On June 10, 2025, after more than 30 years on death row, Anthony Floyd Wainwright was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 54 years old. In his final hours, Wainwright declined the traditional last meal, saying it would distract him from focusing on the people he loved. At 6:10 p.m., the first chemicals entered his system. Witnesses saw his shoulders shudder, his eyes blink, and then his body grew still. By 6:22 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead. Before the execution, Wainwright spoke a final message. He declared his love for his wife Samantha, quoting from the film The Princess Bride. "Death cannot stop true love. All it can do is delay it for a while." He thanked those who supported him, criticized the Florida court system, and attacked his longtime attorney. He offered only one line to Carmen's family, saying he hoped his death would bring them peace, yet he never gave a direct apology. For some witnesses, his words were difficult to hear in the chamber, but the meaning was clear. Wainwright left this world still framing the story on his own terms. For Carmen's family, the execution marked the end of a long legal battle, but not the end of grief. Her sister, Maria David, sat front and center as Wainwright took his last breaths. She said she hoped he felt the same fear that Carmen endured in her final moments. To Maria, the execution by lethal injection was far too gentle compared to the horror her sister suffered. Carmen's mother-in-law, Gail Gayhart, called Wainwright a coward and said that after 31 years, justice had finally been served. Outside the prison, relatives wore shirts reading "Justice for Carmen Gayhart." They embraced one another, acknowledging that while the legal chapter was closed, the loss of Carmen would never be erased. The execution of Anthony Wainwright closed a legal chapter that lasted more than 3 decades. But for Carmen's family, justice did not mean healing. The loss of a daughter, a wife, and a mother can never be undone. This case is a stark reminder that every choice carries consequences. Wainwright's path from petty crime to escape to murder led not only to his own death, but to immeasurable suffering for others. Justice, even when delayed, brings finality, but it can never restore the years stolen from Carmen or the innocence taken from her children. Carmen Gayhart's life was stolen in a single day, while her killer lived 3 more decades before facing the ultimate consequence. What do you think? Does an execution bring true justice, or only an ending? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that explore crime, justice, and the people forever changed by them, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for the next case. Thank you for watching.